I'm just like to make the point that we're very fortunate that His Majesty has allowed us to use Buckingham Palace for this event.
Princess Anne did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The moment she placed Prince Philip's private handwritten note on the table, the room seemed to lose its air. King Charles stared at the familiar writing. Prince William stopped speaking, and Camilla remained completely still. The message contained no complicated accusation and no carefully disguised warning. Philip had named one royal he never trusted, and Anne had finally revealed that the name was Camilla. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Anne had summoned them to Windsor Castle without advisors, private secretaries, or household officials. Windsor was a principal royal home, where the family handled its most sensitive affairs. She carried a folder sealed among her father's papers since his death. Charles watched her place it down. William noticed her hand never trembled. Camilla knew whatever waited inside had been preserved for a reason. Philip had written the note during a delicate transition, when age, succession, and changing loyalties were reshaping the institution. The crown, meaning the monarchy's authority and duty, rather than merely a jeweled object, depended on private discipline as much as public ceremony. His message was not public correspondence. It was a warning meant for whoever might one day protect that authority from weakness within. Anne opened the folder and read from a handwritten account bearing Philip's signature. He identified Camilla as the one royal he had not trusted. He warned that her instinct for influence could collide with the monarchy's stability. The queen consort's expression hardened. She tightened one hand around her chair and asked whether he had truly written those words, or whether Anne had chosen an interpretation designed to wound her. Charles reached for the page before his sister answered. He recognized his father's handwriting instantly. The king read the passage twice, then set it down without looking toward his wife. Camilla waited for him to defend her. He said nothing. That silence hurt more than the accusation, because his hesitation suggested Philip's warning had touched a fear already living inside him. William leaned closer and saw references to private conversations, a disputed palace decision, and a warning that Camilla might test the boundaries of royal authority. Then the prince noticed one underlined phrase near the bottom. Anne had not read it aloud. He asked what it meant. Anne closed the folder. She told him the answer began years earlier, with a confrontation the family had buried. To understand why Philip placed such a devastating judgment on paper, they first had to confront what everyone in that room stood to lose. The note did more than accuse Camilla. It reopened the oldest wounds inside the House of Windsor. For Anne, it was the burden of guarding her father's final judgment. For Charles, it was the agony of choosing between the woman beside him and the man whose approval he had pursued for a lifetime. For William, it was a warning about the crown he would inherit. And for Camilla, it was humiliation from a voice she could no longer confront. Anne had always understood Philip differently from the others. She shared his bluntness, his discipline, and his refusal to soften hard truths simply to preserve comfort. As his daughter, she knew silence could sometimes feel like loyalty. But she also knew that hiding his words now might become a betrayal of the responsibility he had left behind. Charles could forgive an argument. He might never forgive this. Camilla felt years of effort collapsing into one brutal sentence. She had spent decades moving from public rejection toward royal acceptance, believing patience and duty had finally secured her place beside the king. The queen consort, meaning the wife of the reigning monarch, had endured ceremony, criticism, and constant comparison. Yet Philip's note threatened to reduce everything to a colder verdict. Accepted in public, perhaps, but never trusted in private. Charles stood alone beside the window after the first reading, rubbing his thumb across the folded edge of the page. Anger rose in him toward Anne for exposing it, but fear rose even faster. His father's judgment had followed him through childhood, duty, marriage, and the throne. Now the king was forced to wonder whether Philip had seen a danger he himself had chosen not to face. Camilla followed him into the adjoining room. She asked him to say clearly, without hesitation, that his father had been wrong. Charles looked at her, opened his mouth, and paused. It lasted only seconds. To her, it felt like abandonment. She asked again. He still could not give her the certainty she needed. William wanted no part in turning a dead grandfather's private judgment into a weapon. Yet the prince recognized the language. He had raised concerns before about blurred authority, household interference, and influence shaped by personal loyalty rather than royal duty. The crown, meaning the institution and responsibilities of monarchy, could not survive if affection became permission. Anne then gave him the source of her certainty. Philip had addressed the note to the one who will act when sentiment makes others weak, leaving no name. She found a second sealed envelope beside it, containing one of his military insignia, a personal emblem tied to service and command. That was when she knew the message had been left for her. William asked whether Philip's distrust had always existed. Anne shook her head. She told him it was not born from prejudice or old resentment. It hardened on one specific night, when Camilla challenged Philip over the monarchy's future direction. That night had vanished from official recollection, but inside his note, it remained preserved as the exact moment suspicion became certainty. Years before Anne opened the folder, Prince Philip and Camilla stood alone in a private sitting room at Sandringham, after a tense family dinner. The argument lasted less than 20 minutes, but its consequences survived them both. A proposed change to royal duties had placed Charles under pressure, William on alert, and Camilla in direct opposition to the Duke. When she reached for a document Philip had already rejected, he placed his hand over it and told her she was crossing a line. Charles had been pushing to modernize the royal household, hoping to make the monarchy faster, more personal, and less controlled by old habits. The royal household meant the network of staff and advisors supporting senior family members in their official duties. Philip did not oppose change itself. He feared change driven by private loyalty, because access to the sovereign could quickly become influence over the entire institution. Camilla had supported a trusted member of her circle for a prominent ceremonial and charitable position. A royal patronage was an official connection through which a royal supported a charity or public cause. The candidate had little experience inside the monarchy, yet would gain prestige, access, and authority through her backing. Philip rejected the proposal because the appointment appeared to reward personal loyalty rather than proven service. Camilla entered his sitting room after dinner and asked him to reverse that decision. Philip refused. She pressed harder, arguing that Charles needed people around him who believed in his future rather than those still protecting the previous generation. Then she delivered the sentence that changed everything. She said his reign would not be governed by the preferences of those who came before him. Philip removed his glasses and placed them beside the document. He asked whether she was speaking for Charles or attempting to speak through him. Camilla did not answer directly. Instead, she insisted she was protecting the future king from relatives who constantly weakened his confidence and questioned his instincts. She believed loyalty to him should matter more than rigid palace customs. Philip heard devotion in her defense. He also heard possession. The Duke understood that affection could become dangerous when it demanded freedom from scrutiny. Camilla saw herself as Charles's shield, but he feared she might eventually decide that standing beside the sovereign entitled her to shape every decision around him. Anne reached the corridor moments later and saw Camilla leaving with tears of fury in her eyes. She entered the room and found her father gripping the back of a chair. Philip looked at his daughter and spoke with cold certainty. She will mistake proximity for permission. Philip wrote the private note before dawn. In that documented account, he recorded the confrontation, named Camilla as the one royal he never fully trusted, and ordered the warning preserved unless her influence threatened the crown's internal balance. Now that judgment had escaped its envelope. Camilla refused to accept it in silence and demanded that Anne face her without Philip's memory standing between them. Camilla waited until Charles and William had left the room. Then she closed the door herself. No aides stood nearby. No private secretary could soften what followed. Anne remained beside the table with Philip's note under one hand, as the Queen stepped closer and demanded to know why a daughter who claimed to protect her father's dignity had chosen to expose his harshest private judgment. Anne's answer was immediate, because the danger he feared had finally returned. The closed door changed everything. Camilla pushed a chair aside rather than sit, making it clear that she had not stayed behind for a calm discussion. The small Windsor Library, a private room used for reading and sensitive family conversations, now held only two women, one accusation, and years of buried resentment. Anne did not move away. She kept her hand on the folder and met the Queen Consort's anger without blinking. Anne told her she had hidden the note for years. Philip's distrust alone had never been enough to justify tearing the family apart. His words were private, his judgment personal, and his daughter had understood the damage they could cause. But a recent decision had changed that. Silence no longer felt like loyalty. It felt like permission. Camilla's voice cracked as she accused Anne of using a dead man's name as a weapon. She reminded her of the public hatred, private exclusion, and endless judgment she had endured to remain beside Charles. The Queen had waited years for acceptance, only to discover that Philip's hidden words could erase everything. Worse, he was no longer alive to hear her answer. Anne stepped closer. She told Camilla this was not about marriage, affection, or old scandal. It was about power. The sovereign meant the reigning monarch, the person carrying the crown's formal authority. No one standing beside that person, Anne warned, could be allowed to exercise influence without accountability simply because love had opened the door. Camilla had privately urged Charles to approve a new network of royal patronages and advisory access for people loyal to her household. Royal patronages were official links between members of the family and charities or public causes. The plan had bypassed the usual consultation with William, Anne, and senior advisors. Camilla defended it as modernization. She insisted the king needed dependable people around him, not relatives who questioned every decision she supported. She accused William and Anne of treating her loyalty as a threat because they had never trusted her place beside Charles. Anne opened the folder again. She read the underlined sentence William had noticed. The greatest danger will come when he mistakes protecting her for protecting the crown. Camilla's anger vanished. Philip's words no longer sounded like an old grievance. They sounded like a description of Charles now. The sentence had struck its target, but the real struggle would be decided by the one person with the power to reject the warning or act upon it. King Charles sat alone with his father's note and the unsigned approval papers Camilla had urged him to complete. On one side lay the judgment of the man whose expectations had shaped his entire life. On the other rested a decision supported by the woman who had stood beside him through scandal, rejection, and history. He lifted his pen, but did not sign. For the first time, Philip's private warning had turned a family wound into a constitutional choice. Charles alone possessed the authority to approve the proposed changes. A royal patronage was an official connection between a member of the family and a charity or public cause, while advisory access allowed selected figures to influence decisions around the monarch. Anne could object, William could warn him, Camilla could appeal to his heart, but only the king could place his signature beneath the proposal, and only he would carry the consequences if it damaged the crown. The choice cut deeper than policy. Camilla's loyalty had become part of Charles's emotional survival after years of rejection and conflict. He did not simply see her as his wife. He saw her as the person who had remained when the world judged them both. Yet Philip's note suggested that protecting her had begun to cloud his judgment, making personal devotion harder to separate from royal duty. Charles placed the approval papers directly beside his father's handwritten page. He uncapped his fountain pen and lowered it toward the signature line. Then he stopped. Several seconds passed before he set the pen sideways across both documents, as though one small object could hold two opposing forces apart. William entered only after being summoned. The prince chose his words carefully, because attacking Camilla would allow his father to dismiss the entire warning as personal hostility. He told Charles the question was not whether she deserved love, respect, or dignity. The danger was whether informal influence, private persuasion, outside an official process, was being allowed to reshape formal royal authority. Charles had already promised Camilla that the appointments would proceed. Reversing course would humiliate her, strengthen her critics, and make it appear that Philip still controlled the family from beyond the grave. The king felt trapped between breaking his word to his wife and ignoring the final judgment of his father. Anne then disclosed her greater leverage through the documented memorandum attached to Philip's note. A memorandum was a written record preserving important concerns or decisions. It listed 3 earlier occasions when he believed Camilla had pressed Charles to place private loyalty above established royal counsel. Anne warned that she would share it with the senior family if he signed. Charles refused to approve the papers and ordered the proposal suspended. Then he demanded the original note be surrendered to his custody. Anne did not retreat. She said he would receive it only after William had read the full memorandum. The king's hesitation stopped the decision, but it also shattered the fragile trust holding his family together, and the first consequences arrived before the night was over. By midnight, the approval papers had vanished from the king's desk. Camilla's proposed appointments were frozen, and 2 royal households had stopped communicating. What began as a private revelation now threatened to divide the monarchy into competing camps. Yet the most painful moment came away from the arguments. Camilla returned to her rooms, removed a bracelet Charles had given her, and placed it inside a drawer. When he entered moments later, she did not turn around. The suspension spread through the palace within hours. Meetings connected to Camilla's patronage structure were cancelled. Senior aides were ordered not to discuss the dispute, and household officials began checking whether promises had already been made. A royal household was the team of advisors and staff serving a senior member of the family. If appointments had been offered before approval, the problem was no longer merely emotional. It could become an institutional embarrassment. Anne and William believed the pause protected the monarchy from influence that had escaped proper scrutiny. Camilla's staff saw something darker. To them, the decision looked like an organized attempt to weaken the queen consort, reduce her authority, and separate her from the king at the very moment she believed her position had finally become secure. Camilla sat before the darkened window and asked Charles the question he had been avoiding. Had he suspended the plan because he agreed with Anne and William, or because he was still terrified of disappointing Philip? The king looked toward the drawer where she had placed the bracelet. He admitted that he no longer knew where one fear ended and the other began. Charles carried that confusion back to his desk. He wrote a short message ordering Anne to surrender the original note by morning. Then he read it again and tore it apart. The words sounded less like a command from a sovereign and more like the anger of a brother who felt cornered by his sister. Anne soon discovered something worse. The archive envelope still held Philip's handwritten note, but a copy of the supporting memorandum was missing. A memorandum was a written record used to preserve serious concerns or decisions. She knew she had removed only the original page. Someone else possessed the evidence, and that person could expose far more than the family had heard. William received the proof at Kensington Palace. A sealed package contained a photocopy of the memorandum's first page, and no sender's name. One typed sentence appeared beneath it. Ask why the second warning was ignored. The prince called Anne immediately and read the message aloud. She went silent. Then she admitted that Philip had given another warning, but never placed it in writing. It concerned Charles himself. Anne told William to meet her alone before the palace turned suspicion into open war. With loyalties hardening around them, they would now decide whether Philip's warning would destroy the king or finally free him. There was no table between them, no private secretary taking notes, and no monarch waiting in the next room. Anne and William met alone in a small sitting room shortly before dawn. She held no folder this time. What she carried was a memory. Philip's final warning, she explained, had never truly been about Camilla alone. It was about Charles, and the fear that a lifetime of emotional conflict had left him vulnerable to confusing unconditional love with unquestioned judgment. Anne spoke to William as an aunt, not as the Princess Royal addressing the heir. The Princess Royal was the traditional title given to the monarch's eldest daughter, but titles offered no protection in that moment. Both were exhausted. Both knew unresolved loyalties could poison the family William would one day lead. She wanted him to inherit a monarchy governed by judgment, not old emotional debts. Philip had believed Charles's deepest weakness was not indecision, it was emotional indebtedness. Whenever someone gave him the acceptance he felt denied elsewhere, he became fiercely protective of that person. The king could endure public criticism, but he struggled when trusted relatives questioned those closest to him. That instinct made love feel like rescue, and disagreement feel like betrayal. Anne then described her final private conversation with Philip, a spoken account she had never repeated outside the family. Her father had gripped her wrist before she left and warned her never to turn his note into an instrument of revenge. He had not written it to punish Camilla or destroy Charles. He had written it to force honesty when affection made honesty impossible. William felt the meaning shift beneath him. Until then, the prince had treated the note as proof that caution was justified. Now he understood that using Philip's words to defeat Camilla would repeat the same mistake they condemned. Personal pain would once again be allowed to control royal judgment, only this time it would be disguised as duty. Anne also identified the source of the missing page. An elderly former member of Philip's household, a private team that had managed his duties and correspondence, had sent the memorandum copy. The former aide feared Charles would suppress the warning after taking possession of the original. He wanted accountability, not public humiliation. William made his decision. Camilla's appointments would remain cancelled. Future influence would require open consultation. meaning major proposals had to be examined by the family and senior advisors, rather than arranged through private persuasion. Philip's accusations would remain sealed among those already involved. There would be no victory parade for Anne, and no public defeat for the Queen Consort. Anne agreed, but insisted Charles and Camilla hear the terms together without aids. William rose and paused at the door. He would not enter as Philip's grandson seeking vindication. He would enter as the future king demanding peace through boundaries. The private truth had finally produced a path forward, but before they could seal it, the secret escaped the palace and became a judgment delivered by the world. At 6 the next morning, the private note became public. Across Britain, phones lit up with the same astonishing headline. Philip had named Camilla as the one royal he never trusted. The revelation transformed a family confrontation into a national reckoning. Supporters called the warning proof of his fierce instinct for the crown. Critics condemned the exposure as an act of cruelty. And outside Buckingham Palace, one silent gesture captured the country's divided emotion more powerfully than any debate. A major morning newspaper led with a close photograph of Philip beneath the words, "His final warning." A smaller line declared that Anne had exposed his private distrust of Camilla. The front page mattered because it turned a sealed family judgment into a permanent public accusation. Once printed, the words could no longer be contained by palace silence or private explanations. A national broadcaster opened its morning program with Philip's handwritten sentence displayed across the studio screen. The presenter described the crisis as a collision between marital loyalty, inherited duty, and unelected influence. Unelected influence meant private power exercised by someone who held no independent public mandate. The framing was devastating. Camilla was no longer being judged only as Charles's wife, but as a figure whose closeness to the king might shape the crown itself. Outside Buckingham Palace, a small crowd gathered beneath the gates. An elderly man stepped forward, carrying two photographs. One showed Philip in naval uniform, the other showed Camilla standing beside Charles. He placed them side by side, looked at them for several seconds, and walked away without speaking. The gesture captured the division: duty against devotion, warning against loyalty, memory against the present. Camilla watched the coverage alone until Charles entered and switched off the television. She told him the country would now examine every smile, speech, and decision through Philip's accusation. The Queen Consort feared that no statement could erase the suspicion. The king tried to reassure her, but even he could not promise that the shadow would disappear. Anne reacted with fury, rather than triumph, when she learned the note had leaked. She had revealed it through a controlled family reading, not a public interview or press statement. Her father had demanded discipline, yet his warning was now being consumed as spectacle. She understood that the leak had stripped Philip's words of purpose and turned them into entertainment. William immediately requested a formal investigation, but refused to deny the note. Instead, the prince urged Charles to cancel the disputed appointments and announce a transparent process governing senior royal influence. Charles summoned Anne, William, and Camilla to one final private meeting. This time, the pen rested beside a completed statement. The world had delivered its noise, but the monarchy's true verdict would be decided in one room. Through one decision Charles could no longer postpone. The final meeting did not end with Camilla cast out, Anne triumphant, or Charles defeated by his father's memory. It ended with something the royal family had avoided for years: a boundary spoken clearly and accepted without disguise. Charles entered carrying two signed documents. The first canceled the proposed appointments permanently. The second established that no member of the sovereign's household could shape senior royal decisions through private loyalty alone. Then he turned to Camilla. Charles read the decision aloud inside the private Windsor room. The sovereign's household meant the advisors and staff serving the reigning monarch in official duties. He made one point unmistakably clear: the appointments were not being canceled because Philip's distrust had become royal law. They were ending because the process lacked transparency, avoided proper consultation, and placed personal allegiance above collective responsibility. The king looked first at Camilla and then at Anne. He admitted that protecting the people he loved had sometimes made him view scrutiny as betrayal. Whenever someone questioned his wife, he felt they were also questioning his judgment, his marriage, and the painful choices that had defined his life. But Charles refused to let that instinct govern the crown again. Camilla kept one hand on the canceled papers as the verdict settled over her. She did not apologize for loving Charles or for wanting to protect his reign. The queen consort believed her loyalty had helped him survive years of public rejection, yet she accepted that influence without clear limits would always create suspicion. After a long silence, she removed her hand and said she would not challenge the decision. Anne placed Philip's original note before Charles. She told him it belonged in his father's private archive, a protected collection of personal papers sealed from public use. Her duty had been to make the warning heard when silence became dangerous. It had never been to preserve the words as a permanent weapon against Camilla. William watched the tension finally loosen. The prince saw Charles reach across the table and briefly take Anne's hand. Camilla remained seated, but the anger that had controlled her was gone. No one pretended the wound had disappeared. Philip's judgment would never be forgotten, yet it no longer ruled the room. Philip had been right to fear unchecked emotional loyalty, but his distrust did not become a lifelong sentence against Camilla. Instead, the note forced the family to separate love from authority and private devotion from public duty. Anne's exposure ended a dangerous silence. Charles kept his marriage. Camilla kept her place. William inherited a clearer model of accountability, and Philip's warning fulfilled its purpose without destroying the family it had been written to protect. The revelation ended not with exile or revenge, but with a harder royal truth. Love could remain, loyalty could endure, and the crown would survive only when neither was permitted to stand above duty. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.